Skip over some non-important stuff. My name is Bianco. I am a senior systems engineer at Exabine, and I'm going to talk about user behavior intelligence. So real quick, just a quick poll. Who has heard of user behavior intelligence? One person. I think Gartner calls it user behavior analytics. So nobody really has, which is cool for me to be up here talking to you about it because I get to educate you on what this actually is. So we're going to talk about the market a little bit, what you can expect, drill down into the technology, right? And then I'll even share with you a use case, a real-life example of how this actually works. I'll lean in. Let's get this out of the way. All right. I know there's at least one Michigan fan here, so I have to do this, and I'm going to ride this victory as well. All right, so we're going to focus on some numbers, but not just to throw numbers up to scare people and just add fluff to the presentation. These actually mean something, and it kind of leads into why we have this space to begin with. Right, so 766, I don't think that's a big surprise. There's a lot of breaches out there. Maybe that number is. The one I want to hone in on is this 224 number. Right? That's the average number of days an attacker was on the network. That's just over 7 months. Right? Most of the time, we don't even know until we see the credit cards being traded on the black market. So that's a huge problem. 100% of those breaches involve stolen credentials. Now, by the way, these aren't my numbers. These are FireEye Mandiant numbers, so I'm stealing some of their stuff here. But 100% were user credentials that were compromised. Right? 100% of the time, that information existed in log data. We just don't know how to look at it. We don't know how to extract that data out and do something with it. Right? So those three numbers, 224, 100, 100, those are the numbers that have kind of dictated why this space, this user intelligence, behavior intelligence space exists. Right, so we're going to look at those. And just to give you some context around what SIM is really doing today, the Neiman Marcus, not to pick on that, but nearly 60,000 alerts associated with their breach. Right? And you can ask yourself, if you're not in the industry, how does somebody miss 60,000 alerts? Right? That represents less than 1% of their alert volume. So it's easy to miss. And we know that Target had that problem too. Right? And this last number, I think, is a Kaspersky number. It's 200,000 pieces of malware a day. And the reason that number's on there is because that's where we're spending all the money, on the infection, right? Or trying to stop it. So that's what these numbers represent. And this is why this industry is now emerging. We're really at the foothills of this user behavior intelligence as far as an industry is concerned. Right, so we're going to look at all of this. Oh. All right, I promise that's the last one. I mean, come on, I'm in Columbus. I had to come down to Columbus. I'm not going to not acknowledge the obvious stuff. All right, so what these numbers tell us. Number one, obviously it's a long time to detection. That's 224 days. It's way too long. Right? It's ridiculous. And most of the time, we're not even seeing those infections, like I said, until we see them in the black market. The data's there, but we have no visibility into what that data actually means. Right? Number two, what's it say? We're all suffering from alert fatigue, as in the case of Neiman Marcus. Yeah, it has to be right? That's a big problem. So, sorry, do you have VGA on that laptop? Go ahead. VGA. Yeah. Could you please switch to the VGA? Sure. Otherwise, what's happening? Oh, it doesn't work unless we have VGA. We can't capture these slides. Should I start over? I still got a recording, so once you hook it up, it should all start. It just says no signal at the beginning. Yeah, sorry about that, yeah. BJ, these things can do HDMI, but then I wouldn't need this, and I had to go direct and get some extra cables. So part one, part two, and I'll piece them and give myself later, okay? Okay. Yeah. Good? We're good. Okay. Thank you. So, right, these malware alerts, right, that's what we're focused on, the infection. So they're not really prioritized in the way that we need to see them for user behavior intelligence. Right? I know that doesn't make sense yet, but it will. The third thing is we know the attackers want valid user credentials. That's the holy grail. That's what they're after. Right? That's why phishing campaigns exist. That's why keyloggers and screen scrapers and things of that nature exist, right? To get user credentials. It's interesting. Once the attackers get those credentials, how many times you see them coming in over the VPN, the attacker, right? You would think that it's a remote access Trojan or something like that. But when you get valid user credentials, you can come in any way you want because you're almost undetectable at that point. So that's what user behavior intelligence is going to focus on, is the bad use of good credentials, all right? And those credentials are used in the entire attack sequence, as we'll see in a little bit. No more Ohio State, so. So the reason this is happening is because we're focusing on vendor tools, right, to help us. So we look at endpoint, network, float data, packet data, perimeter devices. All that stuff generates a lot of alerts, tens of thousands of alerts, but there's really no focus on that data, right? The next part of this is what we did with all of those alerts. We send them into a SIEM. And I've been a big proponent of SIEM from day one. I think it's awesome. I think it's got its place. It's necessary. Every company should have it. Right? So this is taking that data, it's funneled it down. We perform correlations on the data. We can create reports and visualizations. We can create rules on our own, tell it what we're looking for. Right? That's the key. We have to know what we're looking for, typically, when it comes to SIEM. But hopefully this gets us to incident response quicker, right? So that's great. Now we've taken 10,000 alerts and we've reduced it to 1,000. Still overwhelming for tier 3 individuals to look at, analysts. So we have to do more, right? This gets us part of the way there, but we need to take it a step further. So we can see the attack chain. This is Mandiant and FireEye again. It's a very good depiction of what the attack looks like. But if you look at the initial compromise, and I kind of keep beating this point home that we are spending our money there, but everything that happens after it, we spend money after, but we're spending it there and we're spending it at the end. Maybe egress filtering, trying to prevent the data from going out, right? That's been our focus in security. And the one thing we know is that's largely not working. Right? When the attacker wants to get in, they're going to get in. We can look at all the examples, some Home Depot, Target. Right? So we'll look at this again in a little bit. Just want to focus on where we're spending the money. Now, this slide's not that interesting, really, when it comes to, we know antivirus is not that effective. FireEye is a great product, but nothing that we can put on this list is going to say 100%. But when it comes to user behavior intelligence, we can add these things into the story. So all of a sudden, antivirus actually has a place. It's not necessary for the story, but we can fold it into it. FireEye, we can fold into it, right? When we can tie that stuff to user behavior, it actually gives it more purpose, right? And then if an attacker gets in, sometimes, at least on the endpoint, they can start shutting things down. But really, the reason I put this up is to read this. You can read that yourself. I'll read it to you if you can't see from the back. If the attacker can force the workload back onto the human analyst, then they are succeeding because that means that more malware that can be produced in that manner, the less threats a security firm can detect. Right? So let's overload them, overload the analyst. That's what happens. Render them fairly useless in that case. Not that they're useless, but occupying their time, we can slide different things. And then this one is my favorite. People are still dealing with this problem in a technical way, not a strategic way. They are looking obsessively at new penetrations, but once someone is inside, they can carry on for months on notice. That goes back to our 224 number, right? 224 days. That's the problem. We're focused so much on the infection, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't. We have to some extent, right? But we also need a post-infection answer, and that's where user behavior intelligence steps in. So this is a totally new detection mechanism, a new strategy, something, like I said, that is emerging in the market. And really the question is, what if we just focus on what the attackers want? Right? Ultimately, they want user credentials. Yeah, they want to place a piece of malware on your machine, right? But ultimately, they want your credentials so they can move laterally east and west across the network. So why don't we focus on that and look at that, right? It's not that easy to do, but if you can figure it out, it actually has huge value. And hopefully you'll see this as we go along. So this is what the market looks like currently. It's kind of could be confusing if you're first looking at it, but Right here we have user toolset, which means that you need some level of expertise in order to deploy something like this. Typically it's pretty complex. On the other end of the spectrum, we have something called the autonomous brain, which means it's complete machine learning, right? We don't need to do anything. The machine learns it on its side. It understands what the data is. On the top, we're leveraging existing data, right? And on the bottom here, we have to collect data in order to get it. So we can see where things fall on this graph. So the first thing is canned analytics and custom visualization, right? First thing I'll say about that is anything you see in the market that says canned anything, canned visualization, canned algorithms, right? We've done a tremendous amount of research on this stuff, and we found that these things don't work very well, all right? They're not purpose-built enough. They don't give us enough focus on them. They have their place, right? But they typically require, both of these, requires a lot of high-end users to configure this stuff, and you don't necessarily want that, right? This down here is the leaders in SIM, right? And they're bolt-ons for this sort of thing. It still adds a lot of complexity. You still need a high level of talent to do it. And you actually have to collect the data, which in most SIM cases you probably have already. So this can kind of go right in the middle. Then we have our network-based intelligence. And this is a place where you're going to have to deploy a bunch of agents. So it falls into the category of you have to collect a lot of data to get this in there, right? Although there is a lot of intelligence behind the scene to actually do something with that data. But this is focused mostly on the attacker, right? So when we're doing any kind of intelligence now, we're looking at the attacker. What is the attacker going to do? What's his abnormal behavior? But this is completely different, right? This top right quadrant here is focusing on the user, not the attacker. Right? And by looking at that, we can see the attack, the successful attack. Right? Here we have the ability to leverage existing data. So we pull it from whatever SIM that you have, right? Raw logs, you already have the data. Just take it. And then you have all this intelligence behind the scene to do something with that data. And there is a lot of intelligence behind the scene to do that. So here's that attack chain again, right? The parts I want to focus on are the initial compromise, right? This is ours. The end of the mission is ours. This is that 224 days. But through that attack chain, you can see with these little black dots, right, where the possible credential use would have happened, where you could have seen this happen. So let's take a look at an attack that's pretty well established. And on the left-hand side, you'll see the things that we consider abnormal that you could have seen that was already existing in your log data. So this was, I'm not picking on South Carolina, but this is well documented, right? And it's old, so it's like a year and a half old. This happened on August 13th of 2013, I believe. Spear phishing campaign, like so many others. Right? When they got the credentials, they VPN'd in. So the things that we see on the left are the abnormal activity for the user. Off-hours VPN access. That's abnormal, right? VPN access from a new device. The attacker isn't going to log in and do your job for you. They're going to log in and try to get the data they want, right? Intellectual property, the credit cards, whatever they can sell. Then turn to server and app recon, right? So that's unusual access to servers for that user. They don't usually touch those servers, and now all of a sudden they're touching those servers, right? And finally, the file data theft, which began with crawling of sensitive data on servers, right? So you can pull in GRC data and say that these servers are sensitive. That could have been seen in the logs, and then finally probably the encryption and the exfiltration of the database, right? All that stuff existed in log data if you were looking correctly at it. So there's really three characteristics or three key concepts that we're pointing out. Behaviors of the user, right? What systems were they touched compared to what do they normally touch? What type of access did they have compared to what do they normally? Is it VPN? Is it Telnet, FTP, SSH? Right? Was there an identity or IP switch? Now this is one of the secret sauce ingredients here of the whole thing. You have to be able to keep state on a user session from the log on to the log off. right? That's not an easy thing to do. It is if they just do their normal job. But if they go in and switch credentials, right, to global admin or SSH or something, you have to be able to keep that state on the user. You have to be able to see those credential switches because you're going to track their session, every session that they have, no matter where they go and what they do. Then you look at characteristics, when, what time was the access, right? And this is just kind of a small snippet of the things that you're looking at for user behavior. From where? So let's say I log in from Columbus, and then 5 minutes later I log in locally in Chicago. Right? There's a speed of light rule in there that says I couldn't get to Chicago that quickly. Right? It could be that simple, or it could just be I don't normally log in from China, and now all of a sudden I just logged in from China. Right? So you have to look at geo, look at ISP, IP information, to what, from or to what network zone or subnet. Right? And then you fold in those factual-based rules that we talked about. FireEye, Symantec, Sophos, right? All the alerting that you get that there's a threat while I was on a session. So we can tie that data to the session that I was on. So it associates it with me. Right? So that's more value add over here. But this kind of gives you an idea of what it's looking at least a small snippet. So there's really two elements of this, right? The user behaviors and then the intelligence behind the scenes. The user behaviors are the machine learning of normal behaviors. You compare that to what's been recorded for the user. So you get a baseline of the user's behavior, right? You compare it to what they're doing right now. Not just that. It's interesting because you can compare these recorded behaviors to themselves, but you also compare it to what's called a peer group. So if I work in the sales division, then I'm going to be compared against everybody else in the sales division. What are they doing? Because we have access to the same information, the same assets, the same types of servers, right? So we compare that against everybody else as well. And then you run it through the intelligence engine to tell you if there's any anomalies in that user behavior. So again, I log in from here and then I log in from China, right? That's one item in the session. That's not a whole session. That's just one item. So it tells me that there's something abnormal. Then you go through a risk scoring session. So when you see the anomalous behavior, you start attaching score to those. And the higher the score goes, right, the more risky the session has been. So this is security expertise meets machine learning. The interesting thing is you're going to take each one of these models, right, these algorithms, the geolocation, right, the access time, all of that information is going to be modeled separately. So we look at each one of those things individually. You add them together at the end. Don't make any assumptions about the data, right, when you're doing that. You're going to add it together at the end. And then this is kind of the other thing, that the confidence factor that reduces or eliminates false positives. So you have to see enough data on a user to understand that anomaly should be on the list. If I just started working yesterday, there's not enough data there to tell me, if I go to log into China, that's an anomaly, right? So you have to have enough data, and if you don't, that confidence factor goes down. These things don't make the list. You just don't have enough data to make that determination. And then, again, you go through the scoring system, right, to add points to it. So if you look over here, right, you're pulling raw logs, and then something we haven't talked about yet, which is context. So you're adding contextual data to these logs. So think of all the Active Directory data, not just, email address, but who's your manager, what's your phone number, what location do you work in. All of this stuff enriches the logs, so you converge these two pieces of information, you send it through an anomaly detection engine, right, and then through a rules engine, and then you get incidents. So you'll take 10,000 that you put into SIM, which will reduce it to 1,000. Then you put it through a user behavior intelligence engine, you'll end up with 5. 5 things to look at, because of that confidence factor and the way that this works. So if we look at this kind of in a different context here, right? You take and extract and enrich those logs, you converge it with that Active Directory information. That allows you to build sessions per user. and you record those sessions. So you go back in your sim 90 days or longer, right? Or I think 90 days is probably a good threshold. And you learn what that, it automatically learns based on the data that's already existing inside the sim. It can build sessions, right? And then when it builds sessions, it can understand what's abnormal in those sessions. So it's not just one item, right? What you're looking for is an abnormal session. Not just one thing that's going to trigger that I logged in from China, right? When I logged in from China, I hit servers I never hit before, at times I've never done it. All of these things add up to a session that's a problem. I'll show you a use case kind of related to that later. All right, behavior analysis, then the risk engine, then you end up with a score, a risk score, an incident score, right? Something that you need to go back and look at. So this really focuses the analyst, taking 1,000 events and reducing it to 5. And you'll see the data that you actually get out of this. So that extract and enrich process, right, you're going to take high-value logs. So you're not taking the whole SIM database and moving it over. You're taking half a dozen to a dozen logs, types of logs. And that's all you need, right? You're looking for network and domain information, log on, log off events, Kerberos type events, right? VPN, that sort of information, right? You need to know when people are logging off, logging on the network. Servers and desktops, SSH, remote desktop. These things over here are nice to have. They're not absolutely necessary. This is absolutely necessary. Right, then we talked about those factual-based rules here, security alerts, antivirus, FireEye, et cetera, et cetera. What's actually coming is what's grayed out in data, meaning right now you can see movement around the network. So I log into a network, you can see the lateral movement, where I go, what I touch, when I did it, right? The next iteration of this, you'll be able to see what files I touched, what kind of application transactions that I have, right? And are those anomalies? Are those different from my normal behavior? So this is what a raw log, it's simplified here, but that's what a raw log would look like, an SSH raw log, right? This is what it looks like when you enrich it with data from Active Directory. So now you have the type of server, the privilege level, who the user is, right, the location, the employee, all of this rich data. And it can come from any one of these over here. It doesn't have to come from Active Directory. It can come from wherever you have an HR system, CMDB, whatever. Right? But that gives you now situational awareness on the user. The who, what, where, when, and why of everything. Right? When you enrich that logs. That's kind of a key piece to the process. When you do that, it allows you to build sessions. And this is the second part. So you build a session, right, and you keep track of those sessions for as long as you need to. But at first you go back 90 days, you build all those sessions, right, and then you learn what the user's doing today that's different from what you've learned in the past. And that learning, by the way, has to be a moving window. It can't be static. You can't just learn a user's behavior once and then move on. User might change jobs, might change locations, right? We don't know. So you keep learning every day and let that window slide. So you build the sessions. Kind of looks like this. Now you have a session timeline over here, right? Anywhere you have scoring is anomalous behavior, things that have fallen outside the norm, right? But it gives you the ability to follow that from the start of the day to the end of the day. Log on to log off, no matter how many times they've switched credentials in between. So if we look at the behavior analysis, what you can see on the left here that Jerry, this is our guy now, we're going to talk about Jerry, right? That's his information. We're going to profile him. So let's take VPN, origin location, right? Device he used to connect, et cetera, et cetera. RDP and SSH targets on the internal network. There's actually 130 of these things that you can use to profile a user. Right? So there's a ton behind the scenes that looks at this data. All automatic, by the way. Then you group profile. So again, you take it through what his peer group does, not just him. What does everybody in Jerry's department do? What are they accessing? Right? Because if Jerry just started last week, We don't have enough data to know what's normal or abnormal for Jerry, but we do know what the rest of his business unit does. So you compare it against that. Then you get a baseline. So it basically says Jerry comes through the VPN, he logs into these servers, uses this app, and works with this data. That's his baseline. We understand what Jerry does every day. We understand what he touches, what he uses, right? Now all of a sudden, if Jerry logs in and starts exhibiting abnormal behavior, it's easy to see. Then you take it, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because the next slide will show, but you push it through a risk engine, which attaches scoring to this, right? And the scoring is important because we need to know what to look at. Very simple. I think you guys can probably get that. So let's take a look at that IRS example that we looked at before, right? And this is that rule engine, which is really just a series of questions. I mean, that's not necessarily what it is on the back end, but for human format here, it's just a series of questions that you ask. Has Jerry connected during the weekend? No. So we add 10 points, right? Has Jerry used this device to connect to the VPN in the past? No. 10 points. Has Jerry previously entered the network from abroad? Yes. So we'll give him back some points because he does go out of the country, right? That's not abnormal. Has Jerry previously entered network from Romania? No. So we add 20 points. Now that gives us 35 points, right? Now every sim in the world, if it's configured this way, might be clicking away, sending alerts because Jerry connected from Romania. In this case, there's not enough information to tell us that that's normal or abnormal because you're looking at the entire context of the session. You're not just looking at one event. One event it's all additive in that, right? And by the way, just Jerry coming in from the VPN, that doesn't make any difference. He hasn't done anything other than come in over the VPN, right? So that's not necessarily a problem. But then we keep going further. Has Jerry connected to the server in the past? No. And plus it's a sensitive server, so we're adding a multiplier there. So that's 40 points. Does Jerry's file share contain sensitive information? Yes. 10 points, right? Has Jerry's peer group accessed the server in the past? Now we're looking at his peer group. No, so add points. Now you're at 9, now you trip the threshold here, right? Now as the session goes on, his behavior has gotten way out of whack from what we know to be the case for him and his department. So you can see, and then of course as he crawled file shared, you just keep adding points, that number may go up. Yep.
How's that calculation be affected by, like, say, you bring up a new server, for example, you say you haven't accessed the server in the past, well, nobody has, so
yeah.
There's a way to correct
well, that's the whole purpose of it. One event isn't going to trigger anything, right? And if you end up having, 400 people connecting to a new server, it might show up in their list, but it's not going to trigger anything because that's just one event. Right? What you're looking for is all the abnormal events that added together in a session. Right? That's kind of the beauty behind it. You're not looking at all these false positives. And you can easily say that's a new server. You can tell the system that's a new server. Disregard it. So let's take a look at a kind of a case study. We'll talk about a couple of these things that we've seen in the past. It adds legitimacy to this technology because it's pretty compelling, right? This happened to be a large retailer, one of the largest food and drug, blah, blah, blah. All anonymized, but this is actually real. This happened. They had a user that was logging in over the VPN. Pretty normal behavior, pretty simple, right? The user picked up a piece of malware, virus in this case. Right? Now notice that wasn't seen by the user behavior intelligence engine because that's not something it's looking for, right? It's looking past the infection. We already know we can't stop the infection necessarily, right? So let's look past that and see what happens after. So we'll consider that abnormal behavior getting a virus, although we can probably consider that more normal today than ever before. And then you'll see that she used the VPN to log in, right? That login was seen by the user behavior intelligence engine. It was considered normal because she's done that before. She remote access to 4 systems. That was also seen. That was also considered normal because she usually does that. Then she had a Kerberos log into the server, also seen, also normal, right? Then she did reconnaissance on 1,700 point of sale systems. All right, this is real. I mean, that was seen by the user behavior intelligence engine, and I'll say this a step further: it was only seen by the user behavior intelligence engine. It wasn't seen by anything else. It bypassed everything else that they had, and being one of the largest food and drug retailers, they have everything that everybody else does, right? It got through everything. But hit 1,700 point of sale systems. They said that's absolutely impossible. That can't be the case because we have full segmentation between our VPN and our point of sale system naturally. Why wouldn't we, right? So that's impossible. Not only was it not impossible, it was real, and they found two things, right? Two variants of viruses and a huge misconfiguration in their VPN and segmentation of VLAN, right? Those two things were exposed by this user behavior intelligence. So, pretty compelling, right? Especially that nobody else was able to see anything. Now, if you go back to that original slide, 224 days, if this didn't see it, then that's what you're dealing with. Potentially 224 days of time on the network, right? Stealing credit cards, stealing whatever happens. And it doesn't just have to be a smoking gun. There's all kinds of things that you can see with this because you're looking at user behavior. Improper use of credentials. You've seen that a bunch of times. People using the wrong credentials to do their job. People sharing credentials, right? All of that stuff because we're looking at the credential use. So when you're looking at the credential use, you're going to see all kinds of things you didn't expect. So it's pretty cool. So I kind of raced through some of that stuff, so now I'm going to finish early. So we can wrap up with this and then take some questions. So this is the value prop, right? It focuses on the security team on what attackers want to use, which is valid credentials. That's what needs to be looked at. If they're used 100% of the time in attacks, then we're going to look at what or how they're being used. Bad use of good credentials. Right? And the only way to really do that is to focus on the user behavior. It's really the only way to do this. Look at how they're using the credentials and then compare it against how they're doing it today. You can extract additional value from your existing log. So all your SIMs out there, right? You can add more value to those because that's when the data is coming from. It's already there. You can see, you saw that timeline of the attack before. So you can see that attack timeline. It doesn't just tell you all the bad things that happen. It also tells you all the good things. So you can see the whole session. So there's a use case to go into that, say Sally, we need to look at what she did on this particular date. You can see everything. It can also be dangerous to have that much information, but it's there, and the purpose is we know what the purpose is. Bad use of good credentials. It learns and remembers normal behavior, right? And it keeps learning that normal behavior over time, and it can change normal. So if somebody switches, it'll do that. We talked about the scoring. I think that's pretty clear. We have to add scores to understand when things are bad. And the interesting part here is that it scales so well because, first of all, it's completely out of band. Right? It's not in front of any user. It's just taking SIM data and doing something with it. So it scales to hundreds of thousands of users very quickly, which is a pretty neat use case. Right? And then it gives you that ability to detect cyber attacks in real time in one session, right? One session is all you need to see somebody misusing credentials. You don't need to wait 6 months. You can see it in one session. It'll show up on the dashboard. You go into it, you look at it. It gives you everything that was touched by who, when, all the information that you need. So if they got in and moved laterally, you can see where they moved to. You can see where the attacker went. That's pretty powerful. So that's it. What's that? Questions? Yeah.
So I'm assuming there's some Bayesian like filter and scoring system. Are you able to modify the weight of certain attributes? Let's say a multinational corporation is less ideal if have someone like you from India that's easier to say and localize those in Ohio, so if someone like you from Utah, that's usually an anomaly.
Yeah, it's all adjustable, right? I mean, it's all back-end stuff, and some of that stuff probably, as this market matures, will be exposed in the UI. But yeah, that's all adjustable. But again, since you're only looking at one event, doesn't trigger anything. That's the beauty of this whole thing, is it's building a story. It's adding context around what a user does. So even just one login from another location isn't going to trip anything necessarily, unless that's followed by some other, behavior that we don't expect. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Build upon the user activity. Could you extend that to potentially the computer accounts and other things that are non-human based to prescribe some kind of course of action with that? Do you have login set up for that?
You mean tying it to
Like I said,
asset instead of
account or local account, like running on Windows or not?
Yeah, so you're looking at we're looking at every account, right? And of course, service accounts and everything you can score differently, because those are pretty much in action all the time, and it may look abnormal, but it learns over time anyway. But you can also look at the assets too. So those sessions for the users are associated with assets that they've touched, that they've mapped drives to, they've logged into. All of that stuff is there. So you can look at it from two different perspectives: the user perspective or the asset perspective. It's all there.
How is this different from mature identity access and adaptive access managers that currently exist?
That's a good question. I don't have a good answer for that yet. I've been here for 2 months.
Probably cheaper, I guess that one. But
This is?
most
Yeah, for sure. Well, and again, it drops in on a band, right?
Yeah.
And it's looking completely at user behavior. That's it. So, that's all it cares about. It can take some of that information from user access and single sign-on and two-factor and all that stuff and use it in this. But I don't know if that's necessarily looking, at user behavior, user movement laterally east-west across the network. This is. So that's what you're looking for, is that abnormal movement. And then eventually it's the abnormal file access. Yep.
So assuming that you're compromised at the time that you install and it's learning, because you probably are, realistically, what is the typical approach then to ferreting out, unusual behaviors that were learned by the system, its initial install?
So let me see if I get this right. So once you install it, how do you pair out the
unusual behavior that's going on at the time?
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is when you drop this in, right, you're going to go back to a certain time period in your log data, and you're going to pull that in. So typically, I think the sweet spot is like 90 days. 90 days is enough data to learn user behavior, give you some parameters to tweak it then, right, because there's enough data there, and you'll be able to see that infection or whatever happened, right? Even after you first drop it in. So if you get that 90 days of data and there's something happened in those 90 days, chances are you're going to see it right away.
You're in the middle of those 200 and some days that you're compromised.
Yeah.
Your whole 90 days are assuming that this is normal behavior.
Well, it's not going to necessarily assume that, right? It's going to compare it against the department,
Yeah.
right? What other people, that's why that parameter is in there. So you're not just looking at a user, because a user might be compromised. So you look at the department that they work in. Everybody works in a department, typically, right? And you can see, that'll tell you right there, look, this is abnormal for that department. They don't usually do that. Now you can go into the system and say, yes, this is okay, or no, this is not okay, right? And the thumbs up, thumbs down approach. So if you have that, and because things will bubble up, until you configure service accounts or something, those will bubble up to the top of the list because those are always active, and then you can just say no, those are okay, thumbs up, and they'll disappear and go back into learning.
What are some of the challenges that you mentioned? Scalability, that it would do this over hundreds of thousands of users. I'm thinking of the Fortune 100 group and trying to determine what a peer group is and what department they belong in to try to put them in the right bucket. What are some of the challenges with that? I mean, it's not unique to the solution. Obviously, Fortune 100, you're going to have that problem no matter what, but how do we overcome it here?
Yeah, we're not talking about necessarily this solution. It's just the technology more or less behind it. I've worked with them. I've worked with Fortune 100 companies, and there has not been any challenges. As long as you can get that data from somewhere, and it exists somewhere, and it always does. It may not be an Active Directory, but it may exist in the HR system. And as long as you can CSV that out of there, you don't have a problem, right? And it's something that you can say, hey, we need to clean up this zone file. We need to clean this Active Directory list up a little bit. So there could be a little bit of work depending on how messy your AD is. But I haven't seen that as an issue, believe it or not.
And then the other part of that is not having 90 days, that's the sweet spot. I mean, in some instances, there's log visibility for 9 days. And does it have the ability to kind of pick apart the different user sessions from whatever logs you have available to compare across the greater set?
Yeah, I mean, you need 90 days because you need history, right? Not just on users, but on peer groups, on departments and things. If you don't have that history, your confidence factors are going to go way down and nothing's going to make the list. So what you would have in this case is you put it in, you start grabbing logs, and then build up to 90 days, right? So and unfortunately, that might take you a month and a half or so, or 2 months, whatever it is, to build up that data. 5 minutes. Yes?
What about environments where pure Microsoft, mainframe, Linux, Unix?
Yeah, it doesn't matter. That's the cool thing about this is because it's log data. As long as you're doing something with the log data, right? If it's Unix, as long as you're giving it to the SIM, you can parse anything, right? You literally can parse anything. So it's really agnostic to what environment you have. It doesn't make any difference.
What's the goal of the reaction to the anomaly? You find it, and then what's to keep the target would be the simulator first?
You mean of the attacker?
Yeah.
To anonymize his behavior?
Yes.
I mean, if he knows that this exists, nobody knows. Nobody in this room even knew this was technology. So at least for a while, yeah. I guess that there's always that possibility, but that's pretty tough to do if you steal someone's user's credentials and you're just using them. Right now, what I've seen, I talked about it earlier, VPN traffic. I'm surprised at how many attackers come in over the VPN. When I saw the numbers, I'm like, wow, that is staggering to me. How they're not trying to hide their tracks when they have user credentials. We'll have to cross that bridge, though. Good point. Are we good? All right. Thank you.